So, good evening, my students. My name is Devrat Das. I'll take your ENB 1111, that is History of English Literature. So, a little recap from the last class I'll do. That is, as I have told you, from the third block, that 17th, 18th century, we were studying 17th, 18th century literary movements in England, emphasizing what was there. Like, from we were taking a leap from the Augustan age and all those things to Enlightenment. So, in Enlightenment, what happens? So there was a huge emphasis on religion, and there were most religious conflicts before this era. If you remember my classes on John Milton, and in my masters, actually, I was teaching this thing, Alexander Pope and his mock epic poem that is about Belinda. The name of the poem is Rape of the Lock, which is a famous poem of Augustan era. There was a point, there was the time when, there were two sects of Christianity. One was this Puritans, the Protestants, and there was this Catholics, and there was a conflict between the Parliament and King Louis the Second. I feel I have to look a little bit and say. This was the time of King Charles the Two, and then uh, the absolute monarchy was gone, and then the power of the parliament came in, and there was a lot of things were shifting from feudal world to a more democratic world. I won't say out and out a democratic world, but rather I would say it was leaping a little by little. And if you remember, I had given you one example how struggling it was for the scientific era, the era of rationality, to come from that core religious, more orthodox culture. Because if you remember the scientists like Galileo Galilei, so who had invented the this thing telescope, and he was one of the first and prominent scientists in the west to say that the earth revolved around the sun. Before that, there were many theories of evolution, many theories of creation of man. There were biblical theories, there were theories from every religion had its own theory of creation. Even if you remember, I had spoken about a little bit of this. There were many versions of the Bible, and one of them writes like this women, the Eve came from Adam's ribs. Okay, so the rationality they give is there are we have set of ribs in our chest, inside our chest, and so the lower ribs, you would say, you would see that they don't develop to a fuller form, like they don't come in the middle. Rather, these are like incomplete ones, but structurally and biologically we are made that way. But the rationality they give is those ribs are unfinished or like broken, and the broken parts, from the broken parts the female or the Eve was made. Okay, so this sort of rationality people used to give. And a version also says like the creation of man came from clay. So all sorts of what to say, some, I would say, hypothesis about creation. But nonetheless, when people like Darwin came, the biologist Darwin, Charles Darwin, we talked about uh, origin of creation, or like origin of lives in on Earth. Okay, so he gives rather a more scientific, more empirical, evidence-based hypothesis about creation of man Okay, so this thing had happened. So world was leaping from that religious time to a rational, more scientific era. So people like even philosophers like John Locke and in 17th century, 18th century, someone like Isaac Newton took birth, and then in political theories, Thomas Hobbes. There was invention of this thing, printing press. So before printing press, only the noble people, they had the privilege to study, because the to generate printed books, it was very costly to generate printed books. But when Gutenberg's this thing came, printing machine came, printing had become much industrialized, and all of a sudden the common people had the privilege to study. So with the printing, or the advent of printing press, a new type of literary form has emerged that we know as journalism. The newspaper we see, the newspaper we read every day. So these actually are one of the most, like, cheapest printing sets that we can avail today, because of the highly advanced printing machine that has evolved throughout time. But at that time, Gutenberg's printing press came, and this printing and readership had doubled. Readership had become common between commoners. So people had information in their hands for the first time in history. Basically, the this thing, common people, not the elites, not only the elites. So yes, so who are the prominent, and one of the first people to bring journalism in the world, that is especially in the western world. So it was Joseph Edison and Richard Steele when we talk about England. So yeah, I'll proceed to next slide. So this I have, in this slide I have shown some of the critical pieces of writing, critical essays, critical templates of those times, one by John Locke. That is, so your work will be, to Google these things, and see a little bit homework, like what work is what about what. Since we are studying history of English literature, so it's quite vast, and I have to elaborate other things as well here, because the time is short, and we have to see the fourth block as well. Your exam is coming, and your assignments are due. So okay, moving on. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, just a little bit from Wikipedia you study, or like you'll get a basic idea of what is going on, what is these things. Okay, so moving on next. So this thing I have already discussed, Edison and Steele. So these are one of the most important works of Edison and Steele, that is the Spectator paper, daily essays, that came during 1711 and 12, in that time. So yes, from that point of view, it is important. It is one of the first pieces that was available to the common people. Journalism. So what happened? The textbook, or the books, the novels that you usually had read, it was written in Latin language, the language of the noble people. But with the advent of your printing press, and readership had become common for common people. English language, a colloquial language, which is much simplified language, that was the medium of writing in these newspapers, the spectators, in 1711 and 12. So yes, so this usually in these papers they used to write about the the classics, in a simplified manner. They used to write about their political views, their scientific views, the advancement in of those times. Like say, a scientific journal would be there, to publish the works of Sir Isaac Newton. So, between the common people, the readership was going up. And why would I emphasize on this? Because we also have a section of rise of noble. So you will know how this, kind of leads to a greater number of people, greater number of readership among England in England. So yes, so, what kind of works that had come in the time of rise of novel, the time which we refer to as the rise of novel, means, the readership of novel or writings, novel writing was the most prominent part of people's life, and this was a basic form of entertainment for before the advent of television or radio. Novel people used to read a lot of novels, or uh, uh, novels, novella, literary pieces. So people used to entertain themselves with this literary genres, literary works. So yeah. So when Jonathan Swift writes Gulliver Travels, let's say in 1726, or Daniel Defoe writes Robinson Crusoe 1719, you might be you might be studying about the main common theme between two of this prominent work is shipwreck, or like there is a thing called white man's burden. What is white man's burden? Like in those time in England, the white people, the people of the land, had this burden from their state, or let's say, kind of this was in fashion, that they'll go to a new land. It was much heroic that they'll go to new land, they will somewhere do business with them, or to civilize the world. They kind of politically twisted this word of coloniality, or let's say colonizing others, as they are civilizing others. Others are less civilized, and they used to refer the people who are non-whites as scavengers. So this thing used to happen. And then yeah, so from Jonathan Swift, who was an Irish writer, and Ireland and England at that time had a conflict between the two states, and at one point Ireland was colonized by the people of England, or the whites of England. And you might have heard about the Irish Revolution, or like our Indian nationalists before independence. They also took many help from the Irish people and Russian people. So Irish had a anti England, anti this crown sentiment at that time. So from Jonathan Swift point of view, the Gulliver Travel is it's like a satire to the colonizer. And from Robinson Crusoe, from Daniel Defoe's point, who was an Englishman who was from England. So from his point of view, it was an out and out perception of a white man colonizing other lands. So this type of contrary works you will have in your this thing units. And you can kind of critique on these things, like from one point of view of a colonizer, point of view of the colonized. Okay, so this thing is there. So moving on, then more like the first and foremost novels were more like adventurous, this thing. So Henry Fielding, for example, so it was a picaresque novel on adventure, comic. So this thing, as I said, novels people used to read in those times for their entertainment purpose. And if you had got any, what to say, teaching, or you understand the world through the stories, through its symbolism, it's you are a, what to say, you are a better reader, you are a good critic. Moving on. So this was, as I have said earlier, so this was the time of reason and rationality, and then knowledge and empiricism. That in Locke's and Hume's works, this talks about, like, you don't just believe in facts. You see it, you observe things, then then you believe that, okay, or from your observation, from your this thing. You can sort of emulate, or you can analyze that, the other fact could be right. So from that point of view, it says empirical point of view, seeing. Okay, so this thing is there. And yeah, and also, as I have mentioned, like, this works, like, critique established power. Like, if you see Gulliver Travels, right? So in Gulliver Travel there are many books, and each book says, like, there is a symbolism of, this tiny people. Or, even if you might have seen the adaptation of Gulliver's Travels in Hindi, Jajantaram Mantram, something, Javed Jaffrey's movie is there. So uh, it is on this thing, based on our book, uh, the Gulliver Travels. So it sort of talks about the, how the colonizer come, how is he's a dominant man, how he's big, and other people see it from a point of view of, from a xenophobic point of view, which is like how, it takes time to mingle with the colonizer, and how painful this thing could be. However, the Dajantaram is not a perfect adaptation of this thing, as like the Shakespeare's adaptation you see of Vishal Bhardwaj. So things are different, but you kind of get an idea of the symbolism that Jonathan Swift had to show about the Britishers and the Irish people, all these things. Then again, there are political theories of this time by Hobbes, or let's say Rousseau's social contract that has come in this time. So okay, so now we are talking about a time which emphasized more on rationality, political theories, revolutionary ideas, works of people like Jonathan Swift, works of people like, which has kind of resistance towards the crown. And even if you say out and out, in England there was a problem, there was a tussle between the parliament and the crown. There was no absolute monarchy at that time. So after those period, let's say this time of Augustan age, goes until 1789, from 1669 to 89. So these timings are also important. These are major periods in history. Why so? Because from this point, 1789, there was French Balthasar, there was this French Revolution. So with French Revolution, with Industrial Revolution, the rise of common man becomes a prominent thing. Why so? Because, as I have said, from this time on, the leap of democracy from a feudal world is slowly from a feudal world, it is slipping towards a democracy. Slowly it is becoming. So when you see French July Revolution, or say French Revolution, this time what happens? These people, common men, first time in the history, the common man resist, and took a huge, like, war against whom? The feudal lords, the kings and queens. So monarchs are thrown out at that time, and democracy, for the first time in history, people's rule or democracy. What is a democracy? It's a form of government chosen by the people, its people, right? So there is a significance of election. Okay, so this thing happens, and sort of with this political background, the literature of that time also become important. So in the next, so these are some of the examples I gave from this period, Restoration drama, comedy of manners. You would see like comedy of manners. What you would see, like in mannerism. Let's say we are studying Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock and how Belinda's beauty. If you remember, I was talking about this thing that you'll see from a period that even the men in a British man, used to do makeups, and they used to put powders and highlighters in their face. They used to wear wigs. Even if you see films like Pirates of the Caribbean, the Britishers that those are shown in those films, you sort of resonate with these times, these periods when the nobleman had had a really great emphasis on their looks and stuff. I'm sorry. So yeah, these things. So upon cutting Belinda's lock of her hair, it had become a great issue. Like it had become a great assault. To cutting of the lock, Pope mentioned this as a rape. So that's how Belinda's. The poem also emphasized on Belinda's toiletry ritual. Toiletry means sort of putting up makeup. It used to be called uh, this thing, toilet. So toilet, the spelling of toilet is different here, however. So at that time, the beauty standards of Belinda, like so cut upon cutting, which would have been a very petty thing, like a little bit of hair someone cuts. It's not a big deal, but the society is constructed such a way. The beauty standards of women are penetrated in our society in such a way that cutting a little lock of your hair becomes a big issue for you, because you seem to think that some of your worth lies in your hair. So that is one thing. Okay, moving on. So these are examples of some of the works of that time. You see Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, Afra Ben, who's one of the prominent and one of the first of the feminist writers, her work, Orunko, and yeah, so these things. And then moving on. I talked about rise of the novel, and how the novel comes to. One second. So the genre of the literature, which are novels come to prominence, and I have mentioned some of the important works here of Pamela from Samuel Richardson. It talks about Maid's Virtue, and it was one of the best-selling novel of the time. And then Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, and sort of the kind of literary works that I talked about in my first class, like say let's say Beowulf, or like the kind of works I talked about in your second class, that is your this thing, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and the kind of things, kind of works, kind of society that uh, Geoffrey Chaucer sketches for you, like in those times, like in medieval times. He talked about the morality of people from church, like like the nuns, and how their morality, somehow how he humanizes the nuns, how he humanizes the people from the church, the religious people for say. And then this is one of the work of that time that singularly presents people from every sect, every class, and a story from their life. So that is what our Canterbury Tales is about. And why Canterbury Tales alone stands apart from other works? Because uh, at this moment of time in history, uh, the people who are most important to a state, at least in documents, are the common people. Or the common people had all the power. They have the power to vote. They have to this thing. So we are choosing a history. We are we like a history which talked about common people, not only the nobles. Because uh, in ancient times, whichever book you take, it will either talk about the kings and queens. It will either talk about the nymphs, the fairies, the what to say, the tribal heroes, or let's say the dragons. They are fighting dragons. When I talk about the tribal heroes, like people like Beowulf, like who had a pagan power, and he's a but he's religious, like Christian. He had a Christian ethic. So that kind of character we're talking about. But in what point of history the lives of common people were recorded? Even in history there is a part they call the subaltern history, the history of the commoners. Because either you are talking about MK Gandhi, you are talking about Nehru, or or Abraham Lincoln in the history. But where in history you talk about the lives of the commoners, the Dalits, the untouchables, the lower to lower, group of people. So that kind of that kind of history had become important to us, because we are at the end of the day, it's a commoners world today. We live in democracies, at least in papers we do. So we look for a history that resonate with our life. Moving on. So this is your last block, that is your block 4. So in block 4 we talk about a time from romanticism to Victorian era. So what is romanticism, and when did it come? So it says particularly 18th century, which is what, like in 1700, from 1700 to 1700 99, we call it 1800, right? 18th century, right? So what happened in those times, like especially in the late, it says it clearly mentions that late 18th century and 19th century. So late 18th century, as I have told you, it was the time of French Revolution. It was the time of Industrial Revolution. So with the advent of industrialization, what happened? A rapid urbanization had happened, because this textile had opened up. People used to get work there. The commoners, from villages, they shifted to the cities. Or let's say there was no city, there was no village, but at that time, certain places were getting much populated because of the industrialization, because of opening of textiles, and many other industries, let's say there are current cities that has emerged out of, what to say, coal mining sites in England. So all those things are there. So wherever people, found a better source for their income, they ran to their place, and sort of that become that had, became populated. And those sites were called urban sites, where certain amount of people used to live there, which is higher, much higher than the rural sites. So rural areas were getting empty. Even there are poems you will read about, vacating the rural places, all those things. So I certainly have forgotten the name of that poem, but was it written by Village of? Okay, I forgot. So later on, I'll share with you in WhatsApp. So those things are there. So what happened, in this backdrop, even with repeat industrialization, coming of machines, and and discharging, high amount of industry waste in the river Thames. Thames had turned black. So there were, like, two types of romantic poets, uh, that who wrote in those times. So one of the category was of, William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge, and the other, I would say, was William Blake. So for William Wordsworth, he emphasized on the beauty of nature, and how beautiful life can be. He wanted to emphasize the beauty of, even he has written about extensively on flowers, extensively written on sort of natural elements. So but on the other hand, William Blake, he sort of uh, documented the reality of England in those times, life of, like, industry workers, and the condition of river Thames, how it was becoming polluted, and how this smokes from industry was, sort of polluting the sky. So all these things were there, and sort of, if you want to read what to say, a realistic documentation of England of that time, William Blake's works would do that. But talking of Wordsworth emphasized on nature. Wordsworth emphasized about the beauty, the symmetry, all these things. So these are some of the major romantic poets that I have mentioned here. William Wordsworth, and a little bit about how they have talked about this thing. So as you can see, there is Percy Shelley, who talked about idealism and freedom, and Lord Byron. Uh, So what you can do is, as your homework, like, all these poems, extensively you will study these poets, this their poems in your master degree. But for now, what you can do is sort of Google these poets, and then see their life and their works a little bit, or a summary. These things you can do. Or if you have any issue, or if you want to read more extensively, you can just text me, or mail me. Themes of romantic poetry, as I said. So these are some of the elements, some of the themes that our writers like Wordsworth and Coleridge had emphasized, that is nature as a teacher and a moral guide, emotion over reason. So then again, this is a time from the this is a time that is leaping from the Augustan age to a to the industrialized world, to the what to say, the Victorian world. Okay, so all these things later on, there were Gothic writings of those times. Uh, one of my favorite writer is Edgar Allan Poe. He is not British or of that time, uh, but if you read Poe's poetry, like through darkness, through growth, Gothic narratives, he talked about the inner emotional uh, elements of individuals, which is very much universal in a sense. So if you have time, you should also read about these things, the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe. That will be very helpful for you. For now, these things. Here, the Gothic novels. I'll share with you some of the writers and what they wrote about during these times. Victorian era begins. So it was peak of industrialization, and around this time, the Raj, the British Raj was at epitome. The British Empire was everywhere in the world. So yeah, Victorian era itself was named after Queen Victoria. Period of industrial and social change, as I said, expansion of British Empire, rise of middle class leadership, as I said, with the advent of Gutenberg's this thing, printing press. More people had started reading. So readership was more. So later on, this is Victorian novels. What Victorian novels were. So one of the classic example of Victorian writer is Charles Dickens. So some of his famous books were Bleak House, or say Oliver Twist. So there was a dark theme in Dickens's writings, and much he wrote much about the realistic or reality of England of those times. You know, somewhere even the world was what to say. Uh, it was losing its morality in England, like during those times. Mm, you know, so a lot of what to say. Uh, Underworld writings, or let's say orphans, stories of orphans. Uh, so all these things, much what to say, the reality of a layer of population that at no point of history before that was retained much extensively before him. So these things were there. So these were some of the writers of the time, like Thomas Hardy. His writings follow themes of tragedy and fate, and Dickens, as I said, social injustice. Social reality of those times. Peak of industrialization, peak of the British Empire, but the workers of those times in England. He talked about their lives. Children, child labor, all those things he wrote in those times. So okay, so I'll take another class of yours in history of English literature, and I'll kind of wrap it all up, and I'll give you more questions. Till then, see you.